This isn't a story about bad luck. It's a story about a system that was never built to hold. Lima has always been the political and economic center of gravity, but the majority of Peru's population, particularly in the Andean highlands and rural regions, has historically felt governed at rather than for. That tension is not background texture. It is the engine of almost everything that follows in this video. To understand Peru's political instability, you have to go back to 1990, when a virtually unknown agronomist named Alberto Fujimori came out of nowhere to win the presidency. He came to power at one of the lowest moments in modern Peruvian history. The economy was in freefall. Hyperinflation had hit 7,000% the year before his election. And in the highlands and rural regions, the Maoist insurgency, known as the Shining Path, was waging a campaign of brutal political violence that had already killed tens of thousands of people. 2 years into his term, Fujimori made a move that would define his legacy, and in ways nobody fully anticipated at the time, defined Peru's politics for the next 30 years. He dissolved Congress, suspended the Constitution, and seized direct control of the judiciary, backed by the military. In Peru, this is called an autogolpe, a self-coup, a president destroying democratic institutions, not to be overthrown, but to consolidate power. The international community condemned it, and then largely moved on, because Fujimori's government did capture the Shining Path's leadership, and the economy did stabilize. That combination of authoritarianism and results created a template that still has followers in Peru today. In 1993, Fujimori passed a new constitution. It restructured the government around a unicameral Congress, a single legislative chamber, and embedded within it a clause that would become one of the most consequential and contested phrases in Peruvian political life: permanent moral incapacity. The phrase was never clearly defined. Originally, it gestured towards mental incapacity, a president too unwell to govern, but the Constitution left the interpretation open, and over time, Congress found that open door. To remove a sitting president under this clause, Congress doesn't need a criminal conviction. It doesn't need a court ruling or a formal legal process of any kind. It needs 87 votes out of 130. That clause was designed as a safeguard. What it became instead was a weapon, and we're going to see it used over and over again. If the Constitution explains the instability, Odebrecht explains the rot. Odebrecht was a Brazilian construction company who admitted to paying $788 million in bribes across Latin America. Peru was the hardest hit country. By the end of the 2010s, every single living Peruvian president was implicated. Alejandro Toledo was accused of taking tens of millions tied to a highway project and was later extradited from the United States. Ollanta Humala was detained over illegal campaign financing. Pedro Pablo Kuczynski resigned after revelations that his firm received payments from the company. And in 2019, former President Alan Garcia shot himself the morning police arrived to arrest him. These weren't isolated scandals. They were the same scandal repeating. So that's the foundation. A constitution that was built for control, and a corruption network that reached everyone who tried to lead. Here's what that actually looked like. In 2016, Peru elected Pedro Pablo Kuczynski as president. Under the Constitution, his term should have run 5 years, one administration ending in 2021. What followed instead was 8 presidents in that same decade. 8 presidents. Kuczynski resigned in 2018 after a year and 8 months in office before Congress could vote to impeach him over the Odebrecht scandal. His vice president, Martin Vizcarra, replaced him, lasting 2 years and 7 months before being impeached in November 2020 under the Permanent Moral Incapacity Clause, with allegations of corruption. His replacement was Manuel Moreno, the head of Congress. He lasted 5 days before resigning amid massive political unrest in which 2 protesters were killed by police. Congress then elected Francisco Sagasti to serve out the remainder of the term, which he did, leaving office in July 2021. This was supposed to be the end of Kuczynski's term. Instead, 4 presidents had served in that 5-year window. In 2021, Peru elected Pedro Castillo, a political outsider and rural school teacher from Cajamarca. He ran on the energy of Peru's Andean interior, promising constitutional reform and state control over natural resources. He came into office without a congressional majority, facing opposition blocs from the start. Quickly, things turned sour. Allegations of influence peddling involving family members surfaced, and multiple criminal investigations were opened by Peru's Attorney General. On December 7, 2022, having already survived 2 previous impeachment votes for permanent moral incapacity, Castillo pulled a move straight out of Alberto Fujimori's playbook and attempted a self-coup before Congress could vote a 3rd time. It failed. He had no support. Congress voted anyway. He was impeached and arrested that same day. Next came Dina Boluarte, Castillo's vice president. Her first weeks in office were marked by deadly protests. Security forces killed dozens of demonstrators, most of them in Andean communities far from Lima. What followed was marked by extremely low approval ratings, rising crime rates, and a corruption scandal known as Rolex Gate. Boluarte lasted 34 months before being impeached in October 2025 under the Permanent Moral Incapacity Clause. Jose Harry, the head of Congress, took over. Immediately, there were protests, in which police killed 1 protester. Harry would only last 4 months in office, impeached in February 2026, not under the Permanent Moral Incapacity Clause, but following a motion to censure, tied to his own corruption scandal involving alleged improper business dealings with Chinese businessmen, Chiefagate. It was the first time in this entire sequence that Congress reached for a different tool. Whether that represents institutional evolution or simple opportunism is, frankly, hard to say. As of the time of this recording, Peru's current president is Jose Maria Balcazar. His term will end in July, assuming, for once, it goes according to plan. 2 administrations, 10 years, 8 presidents, and in April, Peru will try again. We came into this story on October 9th, 2025. We landed in Lima just a few short hours before the Peruvian Congress decided to impeach Dina Boluarte just after midnight on October 10th. We had no idea what we had just gotten ourselves into. Peruvians everywhere were fed up. Extortion and homicide rates were running rampant, and Dina Boluarte had some of the worst approval ratings of any Peruvian president ever. By the time we woke up on October 10th, Jose Harry, the head of Congress, was already president. So we decided to hit the streets and talk to people to see what they really thought about the situation and whether any of it came as a surprise to them.
¿Cómo se sintieron cuando escucharon que la presidenta Boluarte fue destituida?
Así que era lo que esperábamos desde que entró, en realidad, como...
Desde que entró.
En realidad que renunciara.
Sí, es verdad.
Esperaban que ella renunciara.
Sí.
Esperamos
Porque,
que...
claro, por incapacidad, ¿no? Y por todas las muertes que se está cargando.
Sí.
Se siente bien, no por el nuevo presidente que tenemos, pero por lo menos es un paso haberla dejado atrás a ella.
Bueno, en realidad, todo el contexto político, podríamos decir lo que es algo a lo que los peruanos hemos estado acostumbrados por mucho tiempo. Y aunque no tiene ese factor choqueante de algo que podría suceder muy inesperadamente después de un largo tiempo de estabilidad política, sí tiene esta sensación de decepción y te hace sentir como que el país realmente está estancado cuando hablamos de lo político.
Es un alivio para todos los peruanos porque es una presidenta que en realidad no ha trabajado mucho por nuestro país y realmente nosotros queremos cambios ahora con todas las extorsiones que hay, ¿no? Y bueno, simplemente queremos que cambien las cosas con el nuevo presidente o las personas que estén a cargo, tanto en nuestro Congreso como en el Poder Ejecutivo también, pues, ¿no?
Y pues piensa que el Congreso toma la buena decisión a sacarla.
Sí, pero sin embargo tampoco es que haya buenas opciones luego de ella, ¿no? Porque ahora se ha elegido un nuevo presidente, Heri, pero no es una buena opción en realidad porque, bueno, tiene muchos antecedentes respecto a acosos o violación sexual, entonces no es algo que realmente sea bueno para nosotros. Sin embargo, igual es bueno que Dina de alguna vez haya ido, ¿no? Por todas las incoherencias al momento que ha dado al momento de hablar en sus discursos, de verdad que es muy penoso que una presidenta se exprese de esa manera cuando es alguien que nos representa y debería tener mejor forma de expresarse y no sentirse como desligada, desvinculada de todo lo que está pasando en el Perú.
No, porque las decisiones que se toman de manera política siempre tienen una finalidad política también. Entonces, esa decisión que han tomado probablemente tenga fines que no sabemos, que están muy por debajo de la mesa Y en un contexto en donde estábamos aproximados a una nueva elección y en donde probablemente ha sido como que suscitado por el tema del contexto de las balaceras que han habido, por el tema de los robos, el tema de los asesinatos y el populismo barato acercándose a las elecciones, no ha sido una decisión acertada, en realidad.
Bueno, a mí me sorprendió, o sea, no me lo esperaba, fue un poco de la nada, ¿no? Porque entiendo que siempre han habido dentro del Congreso varios partidos que son como los que tienen más poder en el Congreso, que han querido mantener a Dina como presidenta porque les convenía, como el partido Keiko, y el de Porky, Renovación Popular, que pusieron como comunicados apoyando al paro y de pronto ayer como quisieron vacarla, y yo pienso que obviamente están haciendo eso porque les conviene, porque se vienen las elecciones y todo el mundo odia a Dina. Entonces en el momento de las elecciones van a poder decir que ellos ayudaron a vacar a Dina, ¿no? Es algo que lo hacen totalmente por conveniencia.
Es que, claro, como él dijo al inicio, realmente un montón de estas bancadas la apoyaron, incluso en momentos ya críticos, o sea, súper críticos, tipo cuando murieron los 67, cuando mataron a los 67 protestantes, por ejemplo, un montón de congresistas salieron a defenderla y esos mismos congresistas ahora votaron para vacarla. Sí. Entonces es muy... como que se fueron de un lado al otro súper rápido y obviamente por una cuestión de oportunismo.
The more that we talked to people, the clearer something became. Their frustration wasn't really geared towards Dina Boluarte anymore. It was towards Congress. This didn't feel like justice. It felt like a power play. And if Congress really cared, then they could have done something a long time ago. When you start to look beneath the surface, a clear pattern emerges. Corruption in Peru isn't surviving solely because of corrupt individuals. It's because an entire system has been tainted. And you didn't have to look that far to see that playing out in real time. The days following Boluarte's impeachment saw massive protests break out across Lima. Harry went as far as to declare a state of emergency. And after a particularly large protest, police killed a demonstrator, Eduardo Mauricio Ruiz. The following morning, we watched Harry arrive at the government palace following a tense congressional hearing. He looked like a man who knew what was coming. And as we now know, 4 short months later, he too would be impeached. Peru's 1993 constitution created a system that looks like accountability on paper. The Attorney General was granted autonomy to pursue high-ranking officials, but Congress was given the power to initiate accusations against those officials and to pass legislation limiting prosecutors' ability to pursue them. Instead of creating a system that fostered oversight, it created a system that could be turned against itself. You don't have to go far back in history to see it in action. In 2024, amid rising homicide rates and a surge in extortions, at a time when 67 out of 130 congressional members were under active investigation for corruption and other offenses, Congress passed legislation narrowing the legal definition of organized crime, explicitly excluding extortion, money laundering, and illicit enrichment. The practical effect was to reduce investigators' access to specialized tools and shorten investigation timelines. Congress, in other words, legislated its own protection. Then, on January 23, 2026, Attorney General Delia Espinosa Valenzuela was removed from office, months after UN officials had expressed concern that Congress was conducting an organized effort to obstruct her work. And it isn't only congressional interference. Former Attorney General Patricia Benavides was herself removed after firing investigators who were looking into her own sister's alleged ties to a criminal organization. The problem doesn't just flow in one direction, and Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index puts a number on it. Peru scores 30 out of 100, ranking 130th out of 182 countries worldwide. The result is a system where impeachment moves far faster than criminal adjudication ever could. Presidents can be removed in days. Corruption cases take years. Executives fall, but the system that produced them doesn't. Congress has the most practical power of any institution in Peru. It also has the lowest public approval of any institution in Peru. And understanding how those two things coexist tells you a lot about why nothing seems to change. Peru's political landscape is defined by fragmentation. The 2026 election has 43 registered parties, not because Peruvians have 43 distinct political visions, but because parties here are built around individuals rather than ideologies. They rise and fall with their founders, leaving behind a legislature perpetually split into shifting blocks where loyalty is transactional and alliances dissolve as quickly as they form. No president in modern Peruvian history has ever entered office with a congressional majority. Every single one has to negotiate from a position of weakness from day one. And yet, despite all of this, the fragmentation, the instability, the revolving door of allegiances, Congress remains the most powerful institution in the country. It controls legislation, budgets, oversight, and as we've seen, the removal of presidents. Recent polls have found that less than 2% of Peruvians approve of it. Less than 2% for the institution that runs the country. That contradiction, near zero public trust, maximum institutional authority, is at the heart of why nothing seems to change.
And to understand congressional power in Peru over the past decade, there's one name you have to know. Keiko Fujimori, daughter of Alberto, three-time presidential candidate, leader of the Fujimorista movement, and arguably the most consequential political figure in Peru to never actually be president. Keiko narrowly lost out on the presidency in both 2016 and 2021. But in 2016, her party, Fuerza Popular, won 73 out of 130 seats in Congress, an outright majority. And Keiko herself wasn't immune to the decade's corruption scandals. She faced legal proceedings over alleged illegal campaign financing tied to Odebrecht, and spent time behind bars before eventually being acquitted.
Whoever wins in April inherits the same foundation. The moral incapacity clause stays, the fragmentation stays, the transactional loyalties stay, and nothing about April changes that. An election can change the face at the top. It does not, on its own, change the structure underneath it.
We've talked about a lot today, but I want to be honest about what we haven't spoken about. Because as long as this video is, it's barely scratched the surface. We barely touched on the Fujimori era beyond the Constitution. What we didn't mention is the intelligence apparatus, the bribery of the media, and the long list of atrocities the country still hasn't fully reckoned with. We mentioned Shining Path, but not the depth of the conflict. Tens of thousands of people killed by both the state and insurgents. Deep, unresolved trauma in rural communities that still has an effect to this day. And we didn't talk about press freedom. Peru is scored 130 out of 180 by Reporters Without Borders. Each of these could get its own video. You'll find links to information as well as all of our sources in the description. Looking ahead, Peruvians head to the polls in April, voting on both the presidency and all 130 congressional seats, with 36 registered presidential candidates making this one of the most crowded elections in the country's history. If no candidate clears 50% of the vote, the top two head to a runoff on June 7th. The frontrunners are former Lima Mayor Rafael Lopez Aliaga and Keiko Fujimori, now on her fourth presidential attempt. No other candidate is currently polling above 5%, though notable names in the field include Carlos Alvarez, Alfonso Lopez Chao, and Cesar Acuña, the last two of whom are already carrying their own corruption allegations into the race. This election carries structural weight beyond just who wins the presidency. For the first time in decades, Peruvians will also vote to constitute a Senate, the result of a 2024 electoral reform that reinstated a bicameral legislature and lifted a ban on consecutive terms for legislators. It's the most significant structural change to Peru's political system since the 1993 Constitution. Whether it changes anything in practice remains to be seen. All winners, president and legislators alike, will serve 5-year terms. When we sat down with locals following the Boluarte impeachment, they shared their hopes for what comes next. Here's what they had to say.
¿Qué esperas por el futuro del país?
Espero que en realidad tengamos buenos gobernantes y no así como tal vez lo tienen otros países o bueno, yo creo que Bukele, por ejemplo, es un claro ejemplo de un buen presidente y quisiera que eso también, las reformas que hizo en su país se implementen aquí, porque es algo que necesitamos. Simplemente acá hay muchas extorsiones, mucha violencia a veces y necesitamos que eso se cambie, ¿no? Creo que todos los peruanos necesitamos que haya un cambio real, porque ya son muchos años llenos de corrupción y que siempre estamos en cambios y cambios de presidentes. Eso no es bueno para nosotros.
Sí, yo solo espero que al menos aparezca un candidato que no sea más de lo mismo, ¿no? Igual son ¿cuántos? 40 candidatos.
Sí, no,
Un montón.
parece difícil que no sea más de lo mismo, ¿no? Pero
Sí.
no. Y sobre Gerí, yo no sé, no creo que llegue hasta, o sea, yo creo que sí lo van a sacar, ¿eh?
¿Tú crees? Yo, o sea, tengo fe de que lo, o sea,
Ojalá,
espero que
me
lo salga.
gustaría también,
Pero
por eso vamos a salir a las calles.
claro, claro.
Pero no, sí, no sé cómo pueda mejorarlo.
Que todos, como tal, podamos entender de que podemos hacer el cambio, así tome tiempo. Así nos lleve muchas generaciones y nos lleve tener que reformar por completo los cimientos de nuestra sociedad. Sí podemos hacer el cambio si es que realmente todos buscamos eso como un propósito en común.
Creo que son demasiadas cosas que se tienen que solucionar. Eh, en todo caso, sí creo que espero un cambio de modelo económico y que de ahí se desprendan los cambios sociales y culturales que ameritan, ¿no?
De todas maneras, nosotros somos unidos y todos los peruanos necesitamos igual salir a trabajar. A veces muchos de nosotros tal vez no estamos involucrados en el tema de en las extorsiones y eso, pero de todas maneras siempre nos apoyamos, ¿no? Siempre estamos unidos, vamos y todos manifestamos y eso siempre ha hecho que las cosas cambien y me gustaría que siga habiendo eso, ¿no? Unión acá en nuestro país.
The question in April isn't just who wins, it's whether the person who wins can actually govern. And based on everything we've looked at today, that's genuinely unclear. Peru's problem isn't a shortage of elections, it's a shortage of trust in institutions, in leaders, and in a system that continues to fail them. But that day in Lima, we didn't see despair. We saw determination. Despite everything that's happened, people continue to show up, and they continue to hope for a better future. What happens in April remains to be seen, but one thing is certain: Peruvians will continue to fight.